Hello and welcome to Cheapskate. I'm Cameron and today we are making removable, height adjustable workbench legs. I'm doing a voiceover because it's really windy out there today. Yes, hello. So yeah, it's all voiceover today. This is 45mm times 90mm pine timber. I think if you're Imperial it would be 1 3/4 by 3.5 inch. And this is a timber housing bracket. Using them in housing for timber framing. And this one is designed to fit 45mm. This is threaded zinc coated rod with some nuts as well. And these are called couplers. They're like really long nuts that are designed to join bits of threaded rod together, but we're using them to insert our threaded rod into our adjustable legs. And I've got some zinc coated or galvanized screws there to screw the brackets in, and I've got a bit of plywood for the feet. More than I need there actually. So I secure the timber into my little El Cheapo workbench. These legs are very cheap, by the way. This is very cheap pine. I've got one of the couplers here, and we're going to insert that into the end of this timber. Now I have here a 12mm drill spade, and the reason I'm using a 12mm drill spade is because the threaded rod that we're using is 10mm, and I want the hole to be just a little bit bigger. I don't want it to be too big because I want the threaded rod to touch the sides of the timber when it's inside. And this is a 16mm drill spade, which is the same width as the coupler when I'm holding the flat sections. When I turn it to so I'm holding the angled sections, it's actually 20mm wide, which is the same as this spade. I'll explain why in a minute. So we start off drilling the 20mm hole. Now the coupler is about the same height as the spade. So I drill about half the depth of the spade. And that's because I only want the nut to easily go in halfway. And then we're going to use the 16mm and we go down to the full depth of the nut there, so that the nut, we can bash it in to that 16mm section, which will hold it in place. You don't actually need any glue, although we will use glue, but you don't actually need it. Just good. Too much sawdust in there. Couldn't see what I was doing. Bit of dust got on the lens too. So this is the 12mm drill bit now, and this is for the rest of the rod. So we're going to go all the way in. Okay, and then you can see we've got 3 different size holes there. Quite nice and neat. And so it goes in halfway into the 20mm section, and where we've got the 16mm section now, we're just going to bash it into that. So the flat sections will fit in that 16mm, but the angled sections will poke into it, and that's what's going to hold it in place. So when I did this is the second one. When I did the first one, I drilled the deepest hole first, which was a big mistake, and ended up coming out really bad because I had to basically, you can just see there, it's awful. I basically had to hold the drill in place while I did it. So now I'm using some epoxy glue. In this case, it's 5-minute araldite. So it's a 2-part adhesive. We mix it together on some scrap wood. So this is just to ensure that the coupler nuts stay in place, and also that we don't get water and gunk in the gaps. I have to put a fair bit on this one. I'm doing the one that I mucked up first because it's got sort of pretty big gaps in it, so I'm using a fair bit of glue to fill in the gaps, and the other one we don't need as much glue. And there you can see with the glue in, and I just leave it in this frame here for a while to dry. Now I'm just measuring the length of the leg. So basically just set it on the ground with my bench in place, put a line against the table underneath, against the leg, sorry, from the table height. There you can see it is there. And then what I do from that height, I measure another 100 mils up, which if you're North American would be 4 inches, I think. And that's the room for adjustment. So we've got the actual depth plus another 100 mils for adjustment. Alright, and now we're just going to cut the feet. Originally I was going to use like a double layer of this plywood for the feet, but then I realised I could do it with just a single layer, and so I didn't actually end up needing that much. Now this piece here was too small for me to risk doing on the table saw. I didn't want to cut my fingers off, so I decided just to use a handsaw. My rusty old handsaw, it must be said. So now I've decided on a position, put the bracket down. Now these brackets do need to be sort of squeezed together to get them the right distance. So I'm just testing where it should sit with the timber in place, and then marking the point for the holes there where I'm going to put the screws in. I'm getting the brackets as close to the center of the table as possible because I want to stop it bowing in the middle. If you're a real beginner to woodworking, the way I select which drill bit to use to put screws in is I want the drill bit to cover up the shaft of the screw without covering up the actual thread. So the thread still shows but the bolt doesn't. That's for drilling into softwoods like pine or chipboard or plywood like this. If I was drilling into hardwood, I would make sure I could only just see a tiniest bit of thread, because hardwood's more likely, it's very hard, so it's more likely to split, whereas softwoods usually just push out of the way. And if you want to get a good grip, you just leave the whole thread showing. I'm just sort of winging it here with the depth. I don't want to go through the table. So I sort of guesstimated it because the table is pretty thick. I can get away with it. Otherwise, you could just use masking tape on the drill bit to use as a depth gauge. So I need to squeeze the bracket into place here so I can get the other screw in. So I decide to, I don't yet, now I decide to hold the bracket and just put it in with my fingers first to get in position, because I can't hold the bracket, put the screw in and drill it at the same time. I've only got 2 hands. And there we go. So I tend not to do any of my screws up fully tight. So we're just checking now to make sure we've got a good fit. So I want the actual timber to be pressing into the table so it's got good support and helps for stability. Now we can drill the other holes. And yeah, I just do my screws up tight at the end, just so the whole thing's balanced and I don't get too much stress on one side, which can tend to pull things out of square. So the last one I do up tight, and then I go and check the others. It's good. Test fit again. Yay. Now I managed to cut my finger somewhere. I started bleeding over everything I was touching. I couldn't work out why, and then I found this cut on my finger. And then I realised where it had come from. There's a lot of rough edges on this bracket. a lot of rough sharp edges, and I obviously just cut myself on the bracket somewhere. So I decided to file it all down. I apologise if you're wearing headphones because the sound of this sort of thin metal being filed is akin to fingers on the chalkboard, so I'm sorry about that. And of course, always try and get the corners, because corners are one spot you always get cuts from. I do actually go over the whole thing here, but I save your ears from me doing the whole thing on video. Now I've put the rod all the way in, and now I'm unscrewing it. You'll notice it's actually quite hard for me to unscrew it, and that's because we only did a 12mm hole with a 10mm rod, so probably the rod is actually touching the timber while it's in there, which is what I wanted, because that will stop the feet unwinding by themselves due to vibration from the saw or the router that I use on this table. And you can see there I've put a bit of white crayon to indicate the depth that it went into the leg. So I'm just measuring that now. You can see there it looks like it's about 85mm. And I'm going to include the foot now as well in the depth, because that's going to take up some of the rod obviously. And I decide to make it about 110mm, which is what I write on the side there. So about 25mm to an inch, so that's just over 4 inches, I'd say. This is my grinder. I've got a cutting blade in the grinder, and we're just cutting the rod to the sizes now. So this thing I'm using was really cheap. It's a universal mount that you can mount various grinders onto, and it's just got a little thing on the bottom to hold things in place. It's good for cutting round stuff like pipes and rods and things, because you just sort of clamp it in and get nice straight cuts. Can be quite difficult cutting round things sometimes. So yeah, really dirt cheap. It wouldn't stand up to industrial use, but it's quite good for home use. You could just use a hacksaw if you wanted to. So there we have it. Now we need to file the ends, because sometimes the threads either get squashed or they get cut very fine when you cut through the rod, and you need to get those little fine bits off, because they will squash down really easily when you try and put the nuts on. So always file away from the threads, so towards the end, and try not to file a whole bunch of threads. Try and just get the end, the very end thread. You don't want to squash your threads or file down your other threads. So now we do test fitting. So going through both ends, just making sure that I get the nut on and off reasonably easily. Always test everything. You don't want to get to the end where you're finally assembling everything and then find out you've got a problem. And as it turns out, I did not set this up for the video. This is literally what happened. This one here, I can't get the nut to go on. And I have a close look at it, and I realise looks like there's a little bit of jagged metal there. And now you can see it's really showing up now, and it just flies off there. You probably can't see it on camera, but it comes off. There's a very thin bit of thread there. And now it goes on just fine. Yay! So now I'm showing you a normal nut, and this is 16 mils wide. This is a 16 mil spade, but on the angle, of course, it's wider. So I'm doing that trick again where I'm just going to bash it in. So I drill the hole, and I don't want to go too deep on top of my table here, because this has got a long point on this spade and it'll go into the table. So once I get it started, I now just put it over this, the in-between part of my workbench. I'm just going to hold it with my fingers and drill the rest of it. I'm not going all the way through, just going about the depth of the nut. Is that enough? Nah. Is that enough? Yeah, probably. Alright, so then it's just a matter of bashing it in. Sometimes it's hard to get started as it nut moves goes in. Sometimes it goes in straight away, sometimes it takes a few goes. This is quite slippery on top, this because this plywood's coated. It's got a flat sort of coating on it, so it can be a little bit slippery on top. And there it is. No, not happy yet. Not flat enough. Now I'm happy. So whenever you don't have a lot of lifting force, like there's nothing pulling straight out against it, then really they stay in really easily. It's only if you, yeah, if it's downward force on it or side force, it'll stay in. So now we just screw it into the leg that we've prepared with the coupler bolt in it. And just screw it in. And of course that's how you now adjust the heights of the leg, is by screwing or unscrewing the foot there. Now I made a mistake here and I forgot to glue the foot on. So when I actually put this on for the first time and went to extend the leg, the foot just screwed off. And I thought, oops. But anyway, I corrected in a moment. So now I'm just test fitting. Now I did write on each leg, I wrote a little B and a little F. Which I think I'll do that in a minute. Because now we have to secure it. So this is a 6mm bolt and nut. This is a stainless steel one, and it's a hex bolt on one end, but it's also it's quite thick, and it's sort of, I forget what you call that kind of thing, but it's got lines on it so you can easily undo it and do it up by hand. So I'm using a 6mm drill bit here now. And I was going to drill through there. I noticed it was vibrating a bit, so I thought, well, I might as well put the timber in there. And I've got to drill a 6mm hole through the timber anyway, so I might as well just do them together. So through the metal and we're through the timber. Now I'm just continuing to go a little bit so I can mark the metal on the other side, because there's not a hole on the other side. So I've just got to want to get it started so when I take the timber out, I can see where I need to drill. And there it is there. You can see a little mark on the other side. And holding it firm with my fingers to stop it vibrating, and making sure, of course, I don't put my hand behind it. It jammed up there a little bit, so I just backed the saw up, the drill, backed the drill up again and went forward again through, and we made a nice hole. Bit of jagged metal sticking out there that you can see. So we'll just file that off now. And there it goes. So I'm putting a B for back on this one, and I put an F for front on the other one, just because they have been individually fitted and they will probably not fit on the other side. So to avoid stuffing around when I'm assembling and unassembling the table, that's why I've done it. So this, I've basically have two workhorses, one on each end of this long table, and then in the middle I'm making these legs that I can remove and obviously put back on again, because I don't have a big enough workshop. My workshop is tiny, so I have to do most of my work outdoors, which is the reason why I have a completely removable table that gets leant up against the side of my shed inside, and the little work tables on the side, they fold up, and I'll take these legs and put them inside as well. I was actually doing some sanding on this table. I had made myself a big sanding beam, and my sanding wasn't coming out level. So I had a look and I realised the whole table was bending in the middle while I was doing the sanding, and so that's what inspired me to get these legs. So I thought, well, if it's happening when I'm sanding, it's probably happening when I'm sawing and routing as well. So I couldn't get it to fit there, so I put the drill back into the timber and sort of went around in circles to widen the entry and exit points of the timber a little bit, and now it fits on quite well. There you go. And so I'm unscrewing the feet because, yep, I forgot to put the glue on. So this is some more of that 5-minute araldite, and just basically whacking it in, getting it all over the threads so that we can adjust the feet without the feet coming off. So yeah, there's not really, all the materials are quite cheap. Like the timber for the legs is really cheap. It's just sort of construction pine. The you could use scrap bits of wood for the feet. And the threaded rod is really cheap. It's much cheaper than buying bolts. You could buy bolts and cut one end off, but the threaded rod's much cheaper. And then just some nuts, and it's, you know, whole job's pretty cheap. I mean, most people would have a drill, I imagine, to get that done. Other than that, you could just use a normal saw and a hacksaw for the rest of it. You don't really need any fancy tools. And now I'm just lengthening the leg. Haven't gone enough there, do it a bit more. I found that once I've adjusted these once to get it right, each time I set the table up, I really only have to do fairly small adjustments. The ground is a little uneven in my backyard, and so I have to adjust it pretty much every time, but once it's stable, it's pretty good. You can see that it's still moving around a little bit once I banged on it a little bit, so the ground just compressed under the foot a little bit. So I just wind it down a little bit more, and then it's rock solid. And I tested the stability by putting a spirit level, a long spirit level on top, and I pushed down quite hard on it, and it didn't move at all. And it used to buckle in the middle when I pushed down hard. Thank you for watching Cheapskate. And I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe.